Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome back to the series on rebuilding the HANA OpenSAP Cloud 2020 sample from scratch. And just to recap where we left off last week, we had successfully built our database module for the first time with just a single entity inside of it. It was enough to be able to test our environmental setup, the fact that we can deploy to HANA, and that basically then that we could go over to the Database Explorer and see that one table that was generated by the entity. Not super exciting because we haven't really developed a lot yet, but enough to establish that our development environment is all correctly set up. So now we want to get into the actual development process, and in this particular episode we want to begin building our data model and using Cloud Application Programming Model CDS to really build our various tables and views that will be the data model for this sample. Now I'll say, we tried to strike a balance with educational materials to not make it too complex as to be overwhelming to the new learner, but at the same time complex enough to be realistic compared to the kinds of things that you have to do in a real application. Now, much of the other learning materials, they try to give you one topic at a time, or demonstrate one feature of development environment. This sample is a little different in that regard, that we're really focused on the end-to-end. Building out a bit of a more realistic application, something closer to what you might have to build yourself. And to that end, we're going to use a lot of features of the Cloud Application Programming Model within just a few entities. So we don't want it to be too overwhelming. We'll keep it to, I don't know what we ended up with, 10, maybe 12 tables that we're going to be working with. It's going to be a simple data model with some master data, business partners, addresses, employees, and then our main transactional tables of purchase order header and purchase order item. That's enough of a structure to be able to explain various relationships and some reuse concepts, but without being hopefully too overwhelming. It'll also allow us the opportunity to later build, various different user interfaces on top of this data model. So with that, let's go ahead into the system and begin building out this data model. So let's go back into the SAP Business Application Studio, and we'll return to our project. And for today's episode, we're primarily going to be working in the DB module. We started, if you remember, with just the simple schema.cds, and all we have is this single little test entity, which we'll leave for now. It's not going to hurt anything. But let's begin building up our larger application like I had described, some of the things that we want to build. We're actually going to start with some common reusable definitions that can be shared by different parts of our application. So I actually want to structure this rather nicely here. So I'm going to put this in a separate file. I'm not going to have a single CDS file that just has everything in it. That would be too big. It would be hard to find things. It would make maintenance more difficult. So I'm going to separate out the different parts here. So to do that, I'm going to say using from, and single quotes, and I'm actually going to put these in a subdirectory. I'm just going to say a subdirectory named schema and a file named common. And it's giving me the little squiggly lines because it says, you know what? It doesn't exist. And it's right. It doesn't exist because we haven't created it yet. So now within our DB folder, not within the source folder, but within the DB folder itself, let's go ahead and add a new folder. Let's call it schema. And then within there, Let's create a new file named common.cds. And what we should see is, if I reload, and maybe because I don't have anything in there yet, it hasn't gone away. Let's go ahead over here to common and start with another using statement. But now what we're going to do is we're going to pull some pre-built definitions that SAP has provided. We're going to pull it from this @SAP-CDS common. And let's go ahead and have a look at that. If we go into our main node modules, we go into the SAP folder and CDS, what we'll find is this common.cds. Now this is pre-built and delivered with the core CDS module itself that makes up the Cloud Application Programming Model. And what SAP has done is modeled these reusable elements for you. For instance, languages, currency, countries, and it's structured them, with good annotations. Here with titles, so we don't have to worry about putting the titles and descriptions and things like that on these columns. They'll be provided by SAP. Even with multiple language versions here, we see all the different language versions that SAP's pre-built in here. The other thing that you're going to see here is some aspects, reusable types with metadata built into them. We're going to use this a lot. For instance, a managed entity would be one that has a created by, created at, modified by, and they'll be set with logic to autofill those with parameters. So for instance, created at will be a timestamp that when a new record is inserted, it will automatically get filled with the current time. Likewise, the modified at has both an onInsert and an onUpdate. So you see there are these built-in actions and then some built-in system variables that we can use to fill some of these things. But we don't have to redefine this, like manage temporal, the canonical universal ID key field. These are predefined by SAP, and we can pull those into our existing model and reuse those. So that's all we're declaring here, saying that we want to, yes, use the SAP from the common, the currency, the temporal, the managed. These are all the things that we just saw here in this centrally supplied module. The first thing that I want to do is I actually want to take an SAP supplied entity, this currency, and I want to extend it. So come here, I'm going to say extend SAP common currencies with, and add some extra columns here for numeric code, exponent, and minor. This allows us to not have to define the entire entity, but just add some additional columns on it. We'll get all the base columns already defined. We're already seeing a very powerful aspect of the Cloud Application Programming Model, which is a form of almost like inheritance or extension, where I can take SAP pre-built or predefined entities and then add my own additional fields, additional attributes onto them. And actually, let's just go ahead and save at this point. That should be enough here. I've got just this one entity, and actually I want to go ahead and build at this point. See why and my error has gone away. Now that I have at least one thing in that file, it's no longer giving me an error message, so it sees the common. That's very good. But let's go ahead and do a Cvs Build, and that's going to compile this. And what we see here is it agrees. And I know what I did wrong here. I got a little ahead of myself trying to build already with this extended entity. It isn't going to pull in these SAP supplied entities until they're referenced by something in my model. So all I've done so far is I've extended that entity. We didn't see it build for that reason. So let's go ahead and come down here and create my own local context. So I'm now creating my own. I can create my own entities and types under a context named OpenSAP-common that can be referenced from other files, as we'll see in just a moment. So we're going to have the SAP-common content. I'm going to reuse some of that in my own common file that can be reused in the rest of my data model as well. And for this, let's start very simply here. Let's create an abstract entity. Actually fill those in just a minute. But in this abstract entity amount, let's format that, we're going to add a reference to currency, and the type is currency. And if you remember, we're using currency, which is really just an alias for SAP common currencies defined in the SAP CDS common reusable layer. So now if we save this, and we go ahead and do a CDS build. Yes, now we see that it creates not just the base HDB table, but now it's creating our SAP Common Currencies HDB table, SAP Common Currencies text HDB table, and a view, because this currency entity that we're extending actually has supports multi-language columns. Let's go back and look at the original definition here, and you'll see that the currencies here, come down and find currencies, is has a title and description on it, and it is a annotate currency. I lost it here. There it is. There it is. Because it is of a type code list, and a code list has a localized string of a name and a description. So once again, we're seeing some reuse here, even in the inner definitions within the SAP supplied file. And also don't be thrown off by the fact that our currencies references code list, but code list isn't defined until later. Things don't have to be defined in a particular order. It makes it easier for you as a developer to define things if you don't have to reference the type before you actually use it. It can be defined later, as in the case here. This aspect of code list is a generic structure, like name and description that's used over and over again. That's what we're going to have in our countries, our currencies, our languages. They're all going to have that core structure of name and description. Localized means that we can have multi-language versions. That's why we have to have a view that will automatically pull the language key for our logon language, or if that's not found, fall back to a default language. So all that processing is built in for you. That's one of the nice things that we have here. And in fact, now if we go into our DB module and we do npm start, which will do the deploy into the database, and you see it's deploying all those things into the database. If we now do a open dbx, and we'll go ahead and open that in another tab. We'll refresh our view of this container in just a second once everything gets loaded up here. Add it back in. There's our HDI container. It says it's already there, but it wasn't showing up in the display, but now it is. All right, it's all good. And if we go to our tables, we now should have more than just our original base. Now we have common currencies and common currencies text. We can see how this is generated for us with the name and the description. A code is a key, and then it's got our extended columns in here as well. So it didn't just take the SAP basic definition, but took and added our extended columns on here as well. So you see how we can start with something that SAP provides, a base data model, and we can extend that to add our own specific needs onto it as well. Now, before we build this out any further, there's obviously a lot more types that we want to define. Let's add a couple other pieces here that we're going to need. First of all, we have some column descriptions coming from the annotations of the SAP Reuse Common module. But we want to add some of our own annotations for descriptions, and we don't want to hard code those in English. We want to put those in a separate I18N file. So let's go ahead and start structuring that. So I'm just going to create another folder here, underscore I18N, put it here in the root. That's where I like to put my reusable translatable text files. And I18N.properties. That will create a default English file. And I've already paired a whole bunch of translations, so you don't have to sit here and watch me type. This is going to supply basically language descriptions for all the attributes of our entire data model. Now, let's go ahead and save that. And I don't think I'm using the default location there. I think if I do a Cvs Build, let's see here. Yeah, it does not look. Well, let's have a look and see if that copied in. Yeah. Looks like that did pick it up okay. If it hadn't, we could have, of course, gone to our package JSON, and we could have configured where our I18N folder was, but it seems to be picking up okay from there and merging that in with the standard definitions. So we're good there. We'll see this in a minute. We'll add some translatable columns here, or column descriptions, I should say. The other thing I want to do, we've got our currency. One thing I didn't show you here is there's no data in it yet. So these pre-built definitions like currencies and countries and things like that, they don't come with data. And I do want to go ahead and populate that in, and I can supply that via CSV files. And if there's a certain structure, naming structure, if I use it right, I don't have to create the HDB table data to map the columns or anything. The Cvs Build will generate all that for me. So I want to take advantage of that. Here, let's just shrink up some of these other columns. So in order to do that, I'm going to come into my DB folder. I'm going to create a subfolder here called Loads. That's where all my CSV files to load data in automatically. I'm going to create another folder here just to kind of match the structure that I'm creating with separate CDS definition files. So I've got this common.cds. So I'm going to create a separate folder named common. Doesn't have to be done that way. I'm doing that just to help me logically structure my project, because I'm going to get more CDS files and I'm going to have multiple entities per CDS file. It can get a little overwhelming if you're not careful, but if you structure things nicely, then it's pretty easy to find them. But the key here is I have to name the CSV file the same as the target entity, including any namespace. And this is going to have the SAP common namespace on it. And then I don't do a dot here at the end of the namespace. I put this namespace on it, SAP common, dash, and then the name of the entity. So this is currencies, .csv. And I do have this prepared as well. And that'll give us our code symbol, name, description, numeric code, minor, and exponent. So our base columns and the ones that we extended into the standard SAP entity as well. Now, if you remember though, remember it had this currencies text, which then has the description offered in multiple locales. We want to add that feature. So we just need another CSV file. So I'll say SAP common and currencies underscore texts.csv. So when you have one of these entities that has the localized entity or a localized attribute in it, so translatable text, you just have to add underscore text on the end of the entity name. And for instance here I will add some German and some French descriptions for some of the currencies. There we are. Now let's go ahead and do a Cvs Build again. And what you see here is now it has created two, we have our two HDB table datas that were generated also, and that will map the CSV columns into our target HDB tables. We didn't have to build the HDB table datas. They were built for us automatically by the Cvs Build, so less maintenance to do. That's very nice. Let's see what impact this had. Now, if we rebuild this into the database, we'll redeploy this all into the database. It's done. Let's come back over to the Database Explorer, and now when we look at the currencies, we do an open data. Yes, I see the default English description with all the base currencies. If I look in the text, yes, I see the German and French descriptions that we loaded. Most importantly, if I access this via the view, we're going to have this localized currency, and it's automatically showing me the descriptions for English, because that's my logon language. What we'll see a little bit later is that when we use this entity in an OData service, it's automatically going to use the localized version and use the view, not the tables directly. So there's no special logic that we have to write, no special views that we have to define. This is all built for you by CDS. And it makes it very easy to use localized or country or language specific descriptions in our entities. We're going to use this throughout the rest of our data model now as well. All right, let's go back to our common CDS. Now, we've already seen a couple of core features of Cloud Application Programming Model when it comes to data modeling. We've seen inheritance or reuse via the using statement, even taking SAP supplied entities, see how we can extend the existing entities and add additional attributes to them, particularly useful when starting with the SAP supplied data model and then adding our own customer extension specific attributes onto there. And we've seen, we've started building an abstract entity here, and we'll build that out more. But there's other things that we want to do. So we define the currencies. We also, another one of these reusable concepts is temporal. And if we go back here and look at, I should probably just keep this one open, keep going back to it, don't I? But if I come back here and we look at temporal, there it is. It's just a way of automatically adding a valid from, valid to onto an entity. And we'll use that later as well. But you'll notice here the valid from, valid to, it isn't annotated. There's no description. Some of these others are annotated, have some built-in descriptions on them. This is not one of them. And I wanted it to have descriptions in the user interface. So here's the other thing we can do. We can extend an SAP delivered entity or type and add additional attributes, but we can also just annotate an existing entity and either add additional annotations, in this case just descriptions, or we can override the annotations that are provided. So once again, another concept of reuse and almost a little bit of inheritance, the way that things can override other things. So there we are. We've added our annotation to the temporal type as well, or the temporal aspect, I should say. Now, in addition to currencies, we also want countries. And once again here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the standard SAP entity. And I'm going to say extend SAP common currencies. I'm going to add some extra columns here. And I'm going to add a link to regions. SAP common countries regions. So we've got a country code, and we're going to go to another entity called regions, which we haven't added yet here, have we? We're going to add it here. We're going to add it here in just a few minutes. In fact, let's go ahead here. What I've done is I have my context open SAP common, but I actually added a second context here in the same file. Let's go ahead and put it in here. For SAP common countries, just to add additional things to the SAP common countries. And I want to add regions in here as well. So let's go ahead and bring the definition of a regions entity. So this is not delivered in the SAP standard common module. We won't find anything to do with regions. But I've added it into the data model. I've enhanced the standard data model here, starting with the countries, but then adding in regions and creating a composition from the delivered countries entity into my own new original entity named regions, with also an association back to countries. Let me just go ahead and format that. That's good. Now the other thing I want to do here, because the regions, it isn't, I'm not inheriting or reusing anything from standard SAP data models, so I want to go ahead and annotate this as well. And as a best practice, I could of course define the annotations on the entity itself, but it's a little bit cleaner and easier to maintain once again if I do the annotations separately. So what I'm going to do is I define the regions, I stick to the basics, just giving it the attributes and their types, pure technical information. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to say annotate regions with, and for each of the columns I'm going to add, in this case, just the column entries, but also some search configuration there as well, some field control that the name is mandatory. So these are all things that can be used later by the UI, particularly a Fiori UI that will read this metadata and adapt the user interface dynamically and accordingly. All right, let's go ahead and save that. So we've got our countries, we've got our regions. Let's just go back up here to our countries. We did add a bunch of extra attributes when we extended countries. So likewise, we're going to want to add an annotation here as well. So let's now annotate our countries just to add descriptions. And we don't need to add descriptions to the standard columns that are already provided by SAP. They have descriptions already. We don't have to worry about redefining those. We can focus just on the ones that we added to the entity as well. So very neat, very clean. I think at this point, what I want to do is I could, of course, go ahead and build, and I would get additional entities here for countries and regions. But what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add the CSV files for these as well. So let's go ahead and add a new file, SAP common underscore countries dash regions.csv. Our regions in. A lot of data there, 4,000 something records, a lot of regions around the world. And then we'll come here, we want to add our countries. sap.common-countries.csv. And one more for our countries. Oh no, I don't have country descriptions. So looks like countries, regions, subentity, and countries CSV. That looks good. So now let's do a CVs Build. And no errors. It has built HDB table data to map countries and countries regions. We have those extra entities now. That all looks good. And if we want to check it in the database, of course we don't have to build it into the database each time, but I'm doing that largely to demonstrate as we go along. I would normally probably work on multiple things at a time, build up more of my data model before I build it into the database. There's no right or wrong here. We'll go ahead and deploy all that into the database. And you see how fast the turnaround time is here. I'm able to, it is very nice that I'm able to immediately build, see the results of that build, come over here and look at the content in the database. And for instance, if I check the countries, there's all our country data. Yeah, that's looking good. And our regions. Also looking good. All right, so once again, we've seen a variety of different techniques. We're starting with SAP delivered data model, the reusable common, and extending it and enhancing it in several different ways here. All right, going back to our common, we've focused a lot on getting these base entities in place for countries, regions, currencies, things like that. Now I want to focus more on our own common things that we want to reuse in the rest of our data model. And to that end, let's start defining a couple of other things. So you can have simple types. For instance, I might come here to my own OpenSAP common context and define two simple types. Business key, string 10, and type sDate, date time. And what I'm doing there is I'm just shortcutting things. For instance, I could come here and I could say test, and I could say, instead of defining string 10, I could say business key. And that type will then automatically be inherited everywhere that it's referenced this way. It's a good way of, as I said, both shortcutting and not having to redefine the types, but also you can imagine if you wanted to change them all centrally, if this was used maybe in 10 different entities, and all of a sudden I decide I want it to be string 10 instead of, or string 12 instead of string 10 in length, I could change it there once in the reusable type, and all the entities that utilize that reusable type would adjust as well. Okay, so that's a simple type. We can do complex types as well, and that's what I want to do next. Put a complex type in here, and what we see is type amount T. a reusable amount type, and it is going to be decimal 15.2, but we're going to go ahead, oh, actually in this case we're going to go ahead and put an annotation on it, and that annotation will also be inherited by every attribute that uses it. So in this case, it's like these other ones. It's still a simple type, but it's a simple type loaded with certain annotations already. So for instance, we'll go ahead and add our gross amount, net amount, and tax amount. And we'll format that as well. But this is still just an abstract entity. Remember, when we did the build, and if we go back over to the Database Explorer, there's nothing called amount yet. There's no table called amount. This is something that we're going to use in the rest of our data model. The purchase order header, the purchase order item, they're all going to have this amount structure in it. And what we can do, instead of defining it multiple times, because we know we're always going to have currency, gross amount, net amount, and tax amount, we can define it once centrally here in this reusable common part of our data model, and then once again just inherit that into all the entities that will use this abstract entity as part of it. And once again, we can change it in one place. We can keep from duplicating the same definitions multiple times as well. We'll go ahead and do a very similar thing here with our quantity and unit. Just like we had an amount type, simple type, we know that we're also going to need quantities, and we're going to do the same sort of thing. We're going to go ahead and put an annotation on it with a description. We're going to have a unit of measure, same thing. We're going ahead and adding our annotation to it as well. So those are nicely kind of preloaded with descriptions and or other semantics. Next, we're going to do something a little bit more advanced. Is we're going to define an enum. All right, so now not only are we defining a type like quantity or unit or amount, we're going to give it, we're going to have a status, string 1, but we're going to list the possible values that could go into this field. And for instance, in our status field, we can have new records, incomplete, approved, rejected. You get the idea here. We're only going to store the code in the database, but we're defining a description for that code as part of the enumeration. And the Cloud Application Programming Model, when we use this type now, we'll also check that the values that are being passed in, and to check them against this enum, the possible values. So we see here we have our abstract entity amount. The other thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and annotate this. We didn't do this earlier because I was just introducing it long enough, quickly enough to be able to build and see our SAP entities get generated. Now I want to go ahead and annotate amount, just once again adding the description columns. Let's go ahead, like we created an abstract entity for amount, because we are always going to group the different amount types with a currency column. We're going to do the same thing here for quantity, so that we're always grouping quantity and quantity unit together. And once again, using those two simple types that we've already declared. So you see how we're kind of building things up here and making a nice reusable structure. I'm going to go ahead and do another enum here for gender. So not just a simple type with the data definition of string 1, but also the allowed possible values here. Go ahead and save that. And we can also, in this case, I'm going to annotate the type itself. So not like I've done here, where I've annotated the entity, the abstract entity, or I've applied the annotations directly in the types. For more complex scenarios, I didn't want to add the annotation directly. That could get a little too complex to read. This makes it more maintainable, once again, more readable. I'm adding the annotation to the gender enum, title and description, but also I'm telling it to assert enum. And this is to tell the Cloud Application Programming Model to please enforce the data types, to perform a check on insert or update to make sure that the value being passed in is in the allowed values of the enum. You'll see this more and more. We're being able to build more validations into the data model itself, which will be applied automatically, compared to maybe the old HDB CDS, where we would have had to use OData exits to do that kind of validation logic. Now we don't need exits nearly as much, because so much of that can be defined here. That's better. Anytime we don't have to write code to do those things, that we can put it in the data model. That's one less piece of complexity, but it also ensures better reuse because we're not relying on exits in the service layer. We're keeping this with the data model itself, and everything that then uses this data model will automatically use these assertions, and we'll see later, actually right now, a few more examples of that. So let's go ahead and define an email type and a phone number type. And we're going to put asserts on these as well. We're going to say assert format, and we're going to give it a regular expression. And once again, what the Cloud Application Programming Model will do is automatically fire this regular expression to validate any values that are being inserted or updated into any entities that then use this type. So what we've done, we haven't even tied it to a particular entity, a particular table, or a particular OData service. We're putting it in the very type definition, the elementary type definition of anywhere where we reuse this email type or this phone number type. We'll get automatic validation built in as well. This is one, for years, I use this example as my main example for OData exits in the old XS OData, where I would validate the email on insert or update. Once again, now I don't need an exit to do that. I can build that into the very data model itself. So let's see here. I think, yeah, that completes most of the types that we want to build. Let me go ahead and I do like doing a CDS build as I go, just to make sure I haven't introduced anything that's breaking my ability to compile my CDS model, which that looked good. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to add a series of views actually. And I'm not going to put this in. I don't think I can put this in any of my context. I'm going to cut and paste a couple things here so you don't have to watch me type as much. But what we're able to define is some specific views on these new entities that we've created. So for instance, I might want a view that automatically gives me the ISO countries by region. So I'm just going to select from countries and then follow the regions association. And you see how easy it is to combine columns from the main entity and columns from the association. So here we see two countries names. So going back from regions back to country so that I can get the country code, the country name, and then the rest of the data from the regions entity. Kind of similar here, I'm going to do just US states. So not only am I going to follow the association, but I'm going to go ahead and put a where condition on here. So I'm not relying on the where condition to be applied at the SQL level, so the logic would have to be done consistently. In this case, I'm going to build it into a view itself where I'll only get US states, and maybe I want another view that will give me US states and territories. So that's everything with country US. I don't have to narrow down the type of region to state. And then finally, I've got another view here called countries as a select from common countries. This one's pretty simple. I actually just wanted to narrow the selection here to the name of the code, but also add annotations. And you see this is a little bit more complex than the annotations we've added so far. I'm actually also adding the Fiori layouting, kind of the UI annotations, which we'll use much later, but this will allow it, because I know this countries is going to be used in a value help selection, and I want to make sure what I'm able to do here is narrow this the display so that it will only show the the country name and the country code and not all those other columns that are part of my country's entity, because they aren't helpful when selecting from a value help. So let's go ahead and save, and we will build once again. Yes, everything looked good. Let's go to our DB folder and do an npm start, and that's going to deploy it all into the database. Very good. We come back over to the Database Explorer, and what we see is not a whole lot has changed, because we have a lot of abstract entities and types, and those don't get generated into the database until they're used by a non-abstract entity. So the rest of our data model will actually cause the creation of those items. We don't see them yet. But the main thing that we do see is our extra views that we define there at the end. And for instance, if I want to look at the regions, but only the, once again, let's just look at the U.S. states. Well, let's look at all the regions first. So if I come here and I look at all the regions for all countries, you'll see, well, I had more than 1,000 records. It limited it to the first 1,000. Okay. Now the same entity, same set of data, let's say give me, let's do an open data on U.S. states. Because the where condition was built into the view itself, now we're going to see just those regions that are U.S. states, which there are 50. That's what you would expect. And you know, maybe sometimes I need states and territories. So there, I see 57, because now we include the territories that are not actually states as well. So there we are. We've got the base foundation of our data model. It may feel that we're kind of moving at a snail's pace. That's to be understood, though, considering all the new concepts that I'm trying to introduce here and explain as we go along. Certainly, it's going to speed up in the next episode. We should be able to define the pretty much the entirety of the rest of our data model in the next episode. Because we won't have to re-explain all the concepts of abstract entities, basic types, the inheritance and reuse concepts here. We'll build on what we've already learned in this lesson, and we'll start to build out the rest of our master data and transactional tables. We'll introduce some new concepts when we start building those entities, of course. There are different relationship types. We're going to see some more reusable aspects in that next section. But by the end of the next episode next week, we'll have a pretty, like I said, we'll have our data model pretty complete, and we'll begin to build other parts of our application utilizing that data model. So I hope you're enjoying the journey so far, learning lots about the cloud application programming model and how it relates to HANA development. And you'll join us again next week as we finish off our base data model.